Okay, so we'll then begin. I hope some more people will join along the way, although it's been a long day, so that's definitely can be felt. So I'm very happy to have you all here in our discussion on board games, and specifically about board games on cities, as the city is this year's theme for our festival. So I'm very glad to introduce two Lithuanian designers, Tomas and Monika, who have worked on the game on the town of Marijampolė, which is getting published quite soon. And also a Non-Breaking Space, a designer from the US working on a game about Bronx, Cross Bronx Expressway, which is also well into development and will be available from GMT Games a bit later. And Pijus, I'll moderate the discussion here that we have. So I'll kick off with a short question, just basically about the background and how you came into board games and designing board games. I don't know, MBS, maybe you could kick off. We'll do. Mm-hmm.
First, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be talking to this. I think it's a very important discussion to be having as we hit this part of our modern journey. The role that cities plays is such an important thing. For myself, I came to games from early on when I was much younger, primarily through card games. I was born in the South, grew up in the Bronx, and cards and dice games were kind of the games that were around as I was growing up. And I probably took one of the more dangerous paths of the card game route, getting into like gambling and some of the poker playing, but pulled back from that. And it happened years later, decades later, in fact, when I started having kids and returned back to board games themselves and realized like the wealth of possibilities that were out there. And through like just sort of exploring what was happening in Euros, exploring what was happening in the war game and historical gaming space, I sort of found this place that I really liked for expressing just sort of the complexities of things that happen in history. And so cities being one of the topics that played such an important role in my life, it was important for me to sort of bring that to the games as well.
Okay, thank you. What about you, Tomas and Monika?
Hello. My beginning of board games was quite easy. You all know game Monopoly. I think I played it when I was just a child, and so I liked some games from kids' journals. You know, those simple, just roll the dice and go games. But more serious gaming came when I was just studying graphic design, and these things collided because graphic design and games and game design and illustrations, all those things. I think my the course of design that I took gave a big impact that I was interested in board games. So I started playing some D&D games, dungeon crawling games, and then my brother just bought a big box of Twilight Imperium, and he said, if this will be the only game that I will buy the biggest game. And for those who know Twilight Imperium, it's a big game and it's a long game. And then we went into serious gaming, and I don't know. I always when you play more difficult games, you gain some momentum and you want to play more difficult games. And how to say you just get used to playing difficult games, and then those easier games, they don't interest you that much. So basically that was my beginning. And for board game design, the pandemic hit, and I noticed that I have a lot of time. I sometimes worked and I get and had some money, and I had a lot of free time, and I ordered a copy of PAX Renaissance. It was a game about Middle Ages, about Renaissance. But I had to wait for that game the whole year, but I got hooked on the idea of the Renaissance idea, and I thought, if I have to wait 1 year for my game to arrive, I will make my own version of that game. So it was my first game designing experience. I did a game about kings and queens and courts and dramas, and inspired by Game of Thrones and such movies. The game was awful. My friends didn't want to play. I spent a lot of time on design, on drawing cards and doing. I ordered a big chunk of pieces from China, just to get all the components. And my friends just played and said, "No, this is an awful game." But I got hooked on doing it better and better, even though it went worse, but I learned a lot about how you think your game is gonna look and how your game really looks on the table and how it feels. So I just got hooked on getting better at it. And Marijampolė is, I think, one of the simplest games I made. And someone says it's too complex too, so I think I hit the jackpot. And Monika?
I should agree. Your first prototype was quite awful, but the second one was fine. When I first saw people playing board games, it was, I think, in 2018, when you were playing Twilight Imperium, and I was scared because there were a lot of figures, a lot of stuff on the table, and I didn't want to play any board games for the next for my whole life. But then pandemic hit, and then we were locked in Marijampolė. We had to spend 2 years in the city, and I was writing my bachelor thesis on the development of Central Square, Basanavičiaus Square in Marijampolė. And then I realized it's not enough. We should create a board game. And we were playing Twilight Struggle all that time, and it is my favorite game so far.
Scoreboard. We had a scoreboard on the wall.
We were obsessed.
Yes.
Yes.
We were obsessed by that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so we know a little bit already about the game of Marijampolė, not a lot, but a bit that it's not that complex, but for some it's already too complex. What about Cross Bronx Expressway, MBS? What is it?
So, Cross Bronx Expressway is about the borough of the Bronx, really the southern section of the borough of the Bronx from 1940 through 2000. And it just sort of tells the history of this section through the lens of urban planning and development. It's a 3-player game. It takes 3-player positions. One player is playing the public, who's like the government faction. They're just sort of working to manage what the public resources are to be able to provide. One player is playing as the private faction, which is just sort of private interests that are there trying to invest and get the most out of what's happening in the city. And then one player represents the community, which is just basically the residents that are within that city or within this area trying to manage what's happening. And it's a card-driven game in a sense because the event cards sort of pace the way that the game unfolds. And the event cards are drawn directly from history. And so for each decade, there's going to be a set of cards, which are events that happened during that decade that each of the players are going to have to contend with while trying to manage their own faction objectives and also work on keeping the area habitable and safe. And so in that way, it's both a city building because I like to say it's almost like a reverse city building because a lot of what happens over the course of this period is a lot of destruction. And it's really managing how you can deal with the destruction of the infrastructure for the cities from both the perspective of these factions, but also from the impacts that it has on the population that lives there. I would love to say that it's a very simple game, but I've been learned that I have very bad judgment of those types of things. I have too fallen down the TI4, the Twilight Imperium hole, and once you go on Twilight Imperium, just like it becomes a whole different world in terms of board games.
Agreed.
Okay, thank you. So, and what's Marijampolė about?
Basically, it's a civilization game, like Seven Wonders or Through the Ages, but it has a theme of one city of Marijampolė, and it is really a strange choice that we chose a small city somewhere in the south of Lithuania instead of the whole world.
Instead of a capital.
Or a capital.
Yeah. Many people say, why Marijampolė? And then they ask, the second question is, are you from Marijampolė? And I said, yes. So I think I am a patriot of my own small city, and I want to represent it, at least for the Lithuanian people. And what about Marijampolė? Yeah, you go through cards, you go to 4 decades of the history of Marijampolė, but I can say it's even though it's a game about one city, but there are some impacts. There are some cards that represent things that impacted the whole world, all the Lithuania, like World War II. Economical crisis, and those things came in. So, like the history about Lithuanian book smuggling when Lithuanian books was banned. So Marijampolė was one of the centers of book smugglers. So you can learn not about Marijampolė, but about the whole context of the world in that particular time.
World War II is what we have now. It happens in both of our games.
Yes.
And your game mechanical is a bit like a sort of, I thought how to define it best, and I thought Pax Pamir Light is sort of what
maybe
came to my mind.
Yes, it has like it has a city state, and players while playing cards change the city state, and one player may want to build an economical background, like build only economical cards. The other player may focuses more on like culture, and depending on which state it is in the particular time, you gain points by how many cards you have of that state. So if it's the economical state and I have 2 economical cards, I gain 2 points. And so I like, because this concept I took it from like Pax Pamir, because even though we are competing all, but each player has it feels like we live in the same city. Just we have different ideas what our city should look. Some people want to see my city as like a big infrastructural and economical center, but some people just want to build culture, and it's more important for them to do that. So yes, Monika, anything to add?
No.
Okay, so both your games explore the histories of cities. So why cities specifically? So of course, yeah, you come from Marijampolė, MBS. You mentioned your background in Bronx, but there's still a lot of topics that you could choose. So why have you decided to focus on urban development as a thematic focus of your game, MBS?
I think it's an important story that doesn't necessarily get told enough, which is that over the past, I guess it's 70 years now. I would love to say like the last half century, but it's a little bit more than that. Cities have gone through major transformations and become completely different things than what they were historically in the past. And a lot of that was by design. A lot of that was intentional. A lot of it wasn't intentional. It's just sort of what the results of those choices that were made were, right? And so when we aren't sort of cognizant of like the way that these things happen, we don't really understand what the actual effect of those choices were. And I think that's the reason why, particularly for the Bronx, the opinions that people have of what happened in that area come from such a limited perspective. Like, no, there's not necessarily this sense of like, oh, you hear about the Bronx and there's this idea that you get from either a movie or a TV or a newspaper clipping, but how it is that it came to be is far more complex and far more tied to some of the other things that were happening in the world than gets a lot of credit for. I think one of the other things that we're seeing today is that the impacts of those choices that were made 50, 70 years ago are now really being recognized. And so there's a huge movement about reflecting on what the role of highways in the United States were in dividing communities and segmenting a particular part of the population in ways that were not necessarily fit, and creating great inequalities throughout these various cities. And so now people are saying we need to be reconsidering how these fit, whether we even need these highways, whether they should be doing this, and how we're going to sort of deal with these populations. But you can only sort of come to those conclusions recognizing that there were choices made in the past and what those choices were. And so the game sort of presents that as a model of just like, how is it that we got to this position? Were these decisions necessary? Were there other options that could have happened? And how can we be thinking about the choices that we're making today and trying to rectify these things?
I think that brings a little bit to my mind this current discussion that we're having in Vilnius, so the city that's not modeled in any of the games here, but where there's a lot of discussions on narrowing down the streets and reworking this sort of section on where cars could pass, etc. So I think that sort of correlates with what you've mentioned as well. What about cities for you?
Well, while making this game, while developing the theme, I felt as though I'm a tourist traveling around Lithuania, because I do not come from Marijampolė, I'm from Druskininkai, and it was all completely new to me. So that is one of the reasons why we did this. And let's not forget that these games, they evoke nostalgia and some city patriotism in people. What do you think, Thomas?
Can you...
So basically, why did you decide to focus on the city? So not necessarily specifically Marijampolė, but why a city as a topic?
It's a very wide topic. It's very... You can see a city from different perspectives, and you can do a lot of it with the theme of the city. So I think, but maybe the most important thing that I just wanted to represent my own city, because I think many people like grow up, finish school, and then go to Vilnius, and they become Vilnius patriots, and they leave their city. And when I see people coming back and wanted to represent the city and to follow the story, and just I think it's just from basic patriotism of my city, and not anything else.
Okay, thank you. And we have a question. Yeah, Arturas.
Yeah, just a quick follow-up on patriotism of your own city. Simple question, do you think it will be a good seller in Marijampolė? Because I guess the people from Marijampolė haven't hoped a board game of their own town.
This is my first game, and we will see. I will do everything that we would touch more people and just advertise it. That as many people as we can reach as many people as we can, but we will see. Many people, when I talk in this industry, doesn't seem much success in it, but I'm staying positive. Yes, we are thinking about selling it like a gift, in tourist information center. We will go to the municipality to discuss these things.
But I think it's more than a souvenir. It's a strategic game. And that was our aim, to create a board game that is not just a souvenir, that you can play even 10 years after, 20 years after.
Yeah, it's a very good city guide. You can take all these cards and see those places and try to visit them. And we did a light version of the game because we wanted to focus on younger generation, kids like 8 years old, and we tested at PineCon Festival, and it was great. Kids as old as 7 years old got the game and got hooked on the game and playing with their parents. So we thought it would be a nice educational game for parents and children to play together.
Yeah, I must admit I've learned a lot about Marijampolė playing it. I know where the stinky hole is, or how is it called? So yeah, it definitely is educational. But in bringing on, following up on that educational point, I think what's becoming more and more interesting in the whole board game subculture or culture is that there is way more criticism of the games, not about, well, if is it fun to play, do the mechanics work or not, but also what arguments the games make. Like the blog of Dan Thuro, who writes a lot of kind of this criticism. I mean, we have more and more in-depth analysis of what games are as cultural artifacts and also what stories they tell. So in your games, what kind of arguments are you trying to make, or what kind of arguments do you think your game makes?
I think the interesting thing is that as much as I have a very sort of subjective perspective on this history, one of the things that I was trying to do with the game is present it in a way for the players to sort of have the opportunity to see it for themselves. And I think the argument is that city building is hard. You know, I think when you look at like the genre of city building overall, a lot of what we've seen in board games so far is like, oh, you just go, you build, you make money, right? Oh, you go, you build, you make money. Who's got the most buildings of this? Who's got the most buildings of that? And by not focusing on sort of what's happening at the sort of population level, by not focusing on like what the impacts of these choices and decisions are having other than the monetary value, a lot of what's actually the challenges of what it means to build out a city gets lost. And so what I hope that players are coming away from it is like, okay, it's really hard to actually work with these three factions together and actually keep a city going. One of the features of Cross Bronx is that it has 2 law states where all the players lose. So if the city goes bankrupt, all the players lose. If there are too many of the population are being pushed off into prisons, all the players lose from disenfranchisement. And so the players themselves are constrained to acting in a fashion that's not going to exploit the people that are on the ground, and that's not going to bankrupt the city as a whole to actually accomplish the goals, which may sort of be counterintuitive to that. And so they have to figure out how to do that within the context of the history. And that's really, really not an easy thing. It's definitely a challenge, especially if you're trying to do so to best the player that's sitting next to you. So I think that is the core. It's just like city building is really hard, and it can have some devastating impacts when we aren't conscious of the choices that were being made.
And when you playtested the game, how often does it end in the sort of all lose or the collapse?
So I always say that everybody's going to lose the first game, their first game, because it's just sort of the mindset that we have, which is just like, oh, I want to score the most points, I want to win, and I'm going to win very well. And inevitably, somebody's going to do that, and they're going to either tank the economy, or they're going to be shipping everybody off to jail, and the game is going to end. And it's not until you sort of recognize that collectively that you actually come around to the negotiations that are necessary to actually keep the city afloat so that you can win. And that's what it's saying. It's like, in order for you to win, you have to keep this city working. And keeping the city working means working with all the other parties in the conversation. Public has to work with the community. They have to talk to the community. They have to engage with the private companies in order to be able to make this work. If you're just trying to do it all on your own, everything's going to fall apart.
Thank you. And so, what about your game? So, what does the game tell?
Victory points in our game, they are called progress points. And there are many ways to gain that progress by building more, by playing all kinds of leaders and using the abilities of famous people from all around Marijampolė and all around Lithuania that come from Marijampolė. And the main question that rises up, I think it's kind of philosophical. What is progress in the city? Is it to build more? Is it to build less? Is having a very urbanized area, is it actually progress? Well, it's a philosophical question, I think, because you can sometimes win by building less, by having less in the city.
Yes, there is a strategy in our game that you can use as much leaders as you can, and they score more points by just using leaders and their abilities. So there was some games, so someone just building an economical site, and the other is just helping other players with their leaders. So, and both gain points. So it's, I think, yes, I would agree with Monika that what is progress? It's the main question of our game.
And what about progress in Bronx?
Yeah, I think I love that sort of framing of like, what is progress? Because I think that's the question of cities today, because cities themselves were sort of defined as this progress in like the human spectrum. And for that like eye of like, we're going to continue to progress. We've done all this work to continue the development of these cities, but then we're looking at the state that we're in today, and it's like, what is progress? Is progress the big highway that cuts through the Bronx, or did that actually cause all of these deaths based off of the exhaust fumes that are now being poured into that area? Those questions really are only answered when you have all of the perspectives sort of spoken for. But if you're just speaking from one perspective, if it's just like, oh, what's economic progress, or what is developmental progress, or what is cultural progress, that only answers for that individual part of it, not the whole. And so you need to see the whole of it interacting to come to an idea of like, okay, is this our collective progress, or are we just sort of letting one person get too far ahead?
Okay, in Marijampolė, how do you see this sort of players? I mean, it's an individual game, so you don't lose together. But so, is there any kind of incentives to look for those collective progress?
There is a mechanical that you can gain points by copying the player on your right, because the state of the city state, if it's not changing, you can just copy the player on your right, and you gain as many points as that player. So it is a cooperation. You can, yes. Monika, maybe something to add?
I would like to add that we have a book smuggler, lietuvininkas, which travels from one player's board to another player's card, not a board. And every time he comes to your tableau, you get victory points, progress points. So do you see the idea in that, well, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, so in the game, so you have these clear, elements of what's important historically for the town of Marijampolė, like the book smuggling being on the border, and other key events. But you also have the mechanic, and this ties on with what we have just been talking about regarding the progress. You have the mechanic where if you don't have resources, you just destroy what you had and rebuild it.
You overbuild it, yes. One time when we were creating this game, I went to all these places, just because I did the artwork of the game too. I had to make photos of some buildings, just to make photos and draw them. And we came across a Jewish holy place, and it is rebuilt in Soviet time. It was rebuilt in a textile factory, something like, textile factory. So I saw that and I got a bit sad, because it was painted in a very, it is still painted in a very awful yellowish color, and I thought this is not progress. But at the time, when the Soviets was occupying our city, maybe they saw it like progress. They just overbuilt it and made a textile fabric, and it was okay for them. But when you look into historical events, and when you look at from today's perspective, it's not progress. But so but still, if you build more in our game, you gain more points at the end of the game. So you still, rebuilding is not the main focus of the game. We wanted to have it clear because if you just use it when you don't have enough resources.
I would say that a good example would be Ilgakromis. 200 years ago, our city used to have a town hall in the center of Marijampolė, but it was not finished because of the Russian occupation in the 19th century. So it was turned overbuilt into kromai, shops used by local Jewish people. And later, after that, it was an abandoned building which was torn down during the World War II. So you can see this in the mechanics of our game, what overbuilding is, yes.
And I think it's a curious relationship to the progress because, on the one hand, you build something, and that as a player, you're incentivized to do that. But if you look from a perspective of other players, sometimes, depending on the situation or just as a whole, it's not necessarily.
It's opposite of progress, I would say. But that's why I say that it is a philosophical question.
And what about building game, but a rebuilding in Bronx MBS?
So one of the pieces that are in the game are discs for each faction, which are infrastructure, and they sort of represent broad. It's like infrastructure is both the housing, it's the running water, it's electricity, all sort of contained in this disc. And so you need to have infrastructure in order to house population, but you have to pay for it, right? And the ability to pay for it is what can drive you into debt. And so there's mechanics in the game where some factions will exhaust, or that infrastructure will be torn down or will become no longer inhabitable. And so the disc flips, and that means that it can no longer house that population. But that gives the other players the opportunity to sort of go and purchase that exhausted infrastructure and then rebuild it as their own. So like the private player can go and say, oh, the public has exhausted these houses, we're going to go buy them and then turn them into condos. And so now it's private, there's not private housing in this area that can house that population again. So that happens, but there's I think a big thing that you start dealing with in the choices that you're making there is that changes both the nature of the district, but it also changes the amount that everybody can make. And if you don't have the housing, that population is unhoused, and it's just going to create more problems. So somebody does need to come there to be able to house that population, but it may be too expensive for anybody to do without going into debt. And that's sort of the dynamic that's at play around when are the choices to be rebuilding, when are the choices to just say, hey, we can't do this anymore, and that population has to figure out how to do housing.
And how would you relate this to the question of progress we've had?
That's a really good question, because I think each of the factions in the game have different ideas of progress. The public's idea of progress is just sort of being able to maintain the status quo. Don't go too much this way, don't go too much that way. Private is like, how much money can we make? And the community is like, hey, can you take care of us, right? And the building of housing or the letting of housing deteriorate can impact everybody's idea of progress, right? And so like the public may say, hey, we need to close these houses down, otherwise the whole city is gonna go bankrupt, right? And the private may say, hey, I'm not gonna build in there because it's not gonna make me any money. Meanwhile, the community is just like, we need houses for these people, or there's just gonna be more people going into jail. All of these sort of play into each other around which progress is most important right now. And for the game itself, it's going to be those two loss conditions of, are there too many people in jail, or are we going to be bankrupting the city? If neither one of those answers is true, then whoever has the turn is going to be able to sort of play on the dynamic of what their idea of progress is.
Okay, thank you. Before we go on, maybe someone in the audience has a question. No, not yet at least. Okay, so getting a bit back from the games that you are designing or you're already finishing, what scope of discussions do you think board games as a platform can open up about cities, about urban environment and their development? Thomas, Monika?
I think the political side of city planning could be explored a little bit more. Well, Thomas presented his prototype today about it was a funny way to look at city planning.
It's basically a game about political corruption. So it's about a city, but when each player is a corrupt politician. So yes, I think some other things that we can explore: environmental problems in cities. I think that's a hot topic, no pun intended. So yeah.
MBS, what do you think?
I think my most important thing is that we sort of start moving beyond cities as just sort of a revenue generator in games. There's so many more like dynamic things that we could be talking about, and so thinking about the cultural and societal impacts and what that does. I think one of the key things to doing that is just thinking of new player positions, right? Who are players in this game? So I'm thinking that like there'd be a great opportunity to really go even lower in the scale in terms of like what does it mean to be an individual living in the city, and that being sort of the perspective that you're seeing for some of the decisions and changes that are happening. I love the idea of like talking about political leaders and the politics that happens behind the scenes. I think a lot of those things get hidden into just like election time, and it's like, oh, who do you like? But there's a lot of wheeling and dealing with that goes on in the background that has amazing effects on our day-to-day lives that we don't even necessarily always take into account. And so games themselves are just great ways to put players into positions of agency about the decisions that are happening. So all of these decisions become things that I think are game.
Okay, thank you. And I think in both of these games that you have, whether it's Cross Bronx Expressway with public-private community, or whether it's Marijampolė, where you're sort of, a little bit like Pax Renaissancy investor in the city. The agency comes through very, very clearly, not as well, sadly, not in some of the other games. So the agency level is, I would agree, something that you can also work on, and it would help make a more varied landscape of board games that are available. And since this is a convention of sci-fi and fantasy, I've sneaked in for the second year in a row something about historical games, but not to make it a total cheating. What do you think about the games, your games, but also board games in general, which deal with historical topics or the current topics as a ways to explore the alternative universes or alternative histories of the subject that you are modeling? Tom, Monika?
I think a lot of games do this job. Like Twilight Struggle, you can imagine what would the world look like if Soviets would occupy the whole Europe, or Pax Renaissance, when you just play with historical facts in any order and see how they unfold each time differently. You can try to think about alternative realities. Like in Pax Renaissance, you can Muslim faith can spread all across Europe, and you can think if that would happen in those years, it could have happened, and how would Marijampolė look now? So yeah, I think I'm more interested in like historical events that happened and did not happen, and how we could have lived in different realities.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. We should create a Tolkien-inspired Marijampolė or sci-fi Marijampolė next time.
Okay, MBS?
I think it's interesting because I would go to the sci-fi sort of in terms of like, we're sort of, science fiction is notoriously about projecting to the future, but talking about the present. And when we have fantastic and future-thinking ideas, they do have an impact on what actually shapes out to be. I mean, like there's tons of technologies that we can trace back to what have come from sci-fi stories and stuff like that. So thinking about historically the role that cities have played in society, I think is an important discussion to be having for the role that we're going to be playing in the future. We're already at a stage in this era where we're thinking about what it means to colonize Mars, what types of cities are we going to try and build when we start going beyond there? How do we sort of imagine that in the context of what we've done, by example, during the period of the Cross Bronx Expressway? Are we going to be doing the same types of things on Mars? Are we going to create these same types of problems? Or are these things that we can begin to address? If we aren't sort of exploring that or taking the history and looking at it with some sort of a critical eye, this is where that phrase comes from. We're bound to just sort of repeat the same mistakes, and it'll be at an even more devastating scale as we think about it on an interplanetary level.
Come to think of it, yeah, I think all of the terraforming or space colonization games, they're just about that part when you get there, and you just conquer, but not how it happens afterwards or within a specific places there.
And so I mean, you take terraforming Mars and think I'm being vague because I'm barely remembering, but you can imagine that you place down these tiles and now you've built this city. Okay, what's going to happen there? What's actually going to be, what's going to be the mode of operations for that? And there's a heavy weight on that I think we aren't really considering, because just the achievement of putting that tile right now is the thing that's in our grasp when we want to get there. But if we don't think ahead, there's not going to be a lot of room for mistakes.
I think that leads, a bit to the actual planning of focusing on the goal and nothing past it, of getting, the city there or there. But it's also what we've discussed previously. It's a progress indicator. So you've built a city, you've got the points, and and you don't. I mean, it will give you revenue. Yeah, you'll get some resources out of it, and that's it. You don't need to deal with all the stuff that's inside it. When working on the games, how much research did it take you, since both of your games are historically grounded?
Monica did all the research.
Well, yes, as I mentioned, I was writing my bachelor thesis, and we had to consult with many people, many local historians, read everything, all the books on that topic, especially Miškinas, historian, well-known. We just read everything we can. We looked up everything we can, and
for me, while I was doing illustrations, there was a lot of job of just searching for photographs and trying to capture the feeling, because many of those things are not, we don't have any information about how the first chapel in Marijampolė looked. So I had to imagine some things, but those things that I want to find, I just searched the whole internet, and how houses looked, how people were dressed, and yes, it took a lot of time to do that.
Did the research that you've done during the process of developing the game, how did it affect the game itself?
I think we started just talking about the city and try to live in those years, and it inspired us more to do that work when we were searching for the information, because Monica always did all the reading, I did all the design, so I was more into photographs, and we often just went and discussed about how it should look, how people were dressed, and I don't know, Monica, maybe you can tell something more.
Some local historians were actually arguing about some facts. For example, about some buildings, about their places, in which places of the city some buildings used to be, for example. They couldn't agree and had different opinions and different sources.
Yeah, and Monica had to write all the information, and she does, on some topics she cannot add that information because historians don't agree on some certain facts. So there's a problem.
And what about you, MBS? So how did the research you did it change your perspective on the idea of the game or how it was developed?
Absolutely. I mean, honestly, I'm still doing the research because I'm starting to do some of the, not just the design notes and stuff like that for the game and the historical notes for the game right now. but there's not a lot of books written about it, and that's the unfortunate. There's books written about New York in general. There's books written about Robert Moses, who was a big part of the game, but about like what happened in the Bronx, there's not a lot of books. And so I was utilizing a lot of those references from the broader New York to tell this story to begin with. And then of late, I've been actually going to the Bronx Historical Society and going and gathering some of the firsthand accounts and some of the materials there to actually sort of fill out the story, which is changing not necessarily the mechanics, but it's changing some of the arcs that happen, some of the things that happened over a decade. It's like, oh, well, maybe this needs to sort of adjust a little bit to account for what we are seeing from the records of the Business Association of the Bronx during that period and what their focus was at that time. And so a lot of that work is, like I said, still being done. I think I'm beyond the point of actually changing things in the game right now, but really want to make sure that when the game is released, it has enough of the historical context to really provide the readers with an understanding of what's being expressed through the game.
I think that's one of the good things about GMT games, that they give space for historical notes to accompany the game. So I saw also that you've mentioned this, the life and death of the great American cities, which we've recently got translated into Lithuanian too, as one of the inspirations behind the game. Okay, I think we're running out of time, getting close to another part about surviving in post-apocalyptic cities. So thanks everyone, thanks MBS for joining. Have a nice day, it's just a start for you. Thanks Thomas and Monika, and thanks everybody who attended.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.